Yeah, I hope you got that on tape.
That may be the worst one yet.
All right. Are we live?
Yep, we're good to go.
Live. All right, here we go. Welcome everyone. This is the House Energy and Digital Infrastructure Committee on Friday afternoon, April 4th, 2025. Oh boy. It's been a long week. And we are here to hear from Gavin Boyles, Deputy Treasurer. And we'll go around the room and introduce ourselves as is our custom. I'm Scott Campbell, Vice Chair. The Chair is out today. And I'm from St. Johnsbury, Caledonia, Essex District.
Richard Bailey, Lamoille 2. Chris Mara, Wyndham, Windsor, Bennington. Michael Southworth, Caledonia 2.
And Clifton, Chittenden, 13, Burlington.
And we have also, we have in the room.
Ashley Duran, Director of Policy for the Treasurer's Office.
And I'm Jack Locker, committee assistant.
Olivia Geeker with PT Digger.
Okay, thank you very much.
And for your record, Gavin Boyles, the Deputy Treasurer. Thanks for having us in. So here to talk about what's colloquially known as the Climate Superfund, or sometimes the Polluters Pay Act from last year. Last year it was Act 122, and this year there's a House Bill 319 pending. It's currently in front of Senate Natural Resources. And so we've testified there this week, as have others. And my understanding was that this committee just wanted kind of a primer on on the Superfund and kind of an update on where we stand with that.
Sure. Well, we had a walkthrough from that's council, Michael O'Grady, just before.
Oh, great.
You,
Okay.
So we have some grounding in the bill.
Good.
I guess it would be interesting to hear from you about the report that was delivered on January 15th.
Sure.
And any changes that Treasurer's Office and we can see natural resources, if you try to speak to them, are requesting and to the bill.
Yes. Great. Great. So maybe I'll just begin by, since you have that background, I'll just kind of emphasize what the treasurer's relatively limited role in it. It's a central role, but it is confined. So we were asked to evaluate the damages and abatement costs resulting from greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. That analysis is both backward and forward looking. I'm sure you heard from Councilor O'Grady that it's based on the emissions of a particular set of refiners and extractors. So because the evaluation of damages that we were called upon to do is fundamentally a scientific endeavor that we don't have the in-house ability to do, we together with ANR issued a request for information, which is just what it sounds like. It's sort of often preliminary to a request for proposals, as it is hopefully in this case. And the request for information was essentially asking the world, please come forth and tell us if you can do this work. Whether there are any impediments to you doing this work, whether you've done this work before, and if so, for whom. So we collect responses, that informed the report, which we worked with ANR on to get in January. And, I think I'm reluctant to speak too much for ANR, but I can, when I get to the amendment that's been requested, I do feel comfortable speaking to them on that.
Even before you get to that, sure. One of the questions that I had with Councilor O'Grady was the nexus to Vermont, and we did talk about that a little bit. I guess I'm still not completely clear about it. The proportion, first of all, the responsible parties are those entities that are involved in extracting or refining fossil fuels that emit more than a billion metric tons. I believe there is greenhouse gases in that time period, 1995 to 2024. And it sounded like any entity that sold any amount of that fuel into Vermont, and it gets a little mushy trying to determine how much of any of those entities, ExxonMobil, Valero, whatever the companies are, how much, what proportion of the fuel burned in Vermont, let's say, fuel distributed in Vermont, what proportion any of those companies comes from any of those companies. So how do we establish a proportion?
Well, I think there's a couple answers. One is that I am a little reluctant to comment because it's really not our part of the analysis. The other is that I suspect it would be subject of expert testimony,
Right.
Competing expert testimony and trial.
This is part of what is to be determined, I guess. Is what
Yes, and it's A&R's part. So I think A&R would answer that question much more in-depthly than me. So for our part, so there's sort of that preliminary part, which is is far from trivial.
I was asking conceptually, and not details, just conceptually, but that's fine. We'll leave that aside for that.
Yeah, I think even conceptually, I'd be reluctant to comment. Yeah, I'm sorry. So our part is sort of the emissions having happened. What changes have they caused to flooding, heat, pests, health? There's a list in Act 122 of the sort of a presumptive list, I guess I'll say, of climate damages. We think, based on the RFI responses and just on our own experience, that flooding is kind of number one on that list in terms of damages that climate change has caused and will cause in Vermont. But what we saw in the RFI responses, was, I'll say from our perspective, reassuring, that there are multiple entities that have done this work. There are entities that have done it on a statewide basis for other states. There are entities that have done the work for a variety of states with kind of a variety of landscapes. They've done it for coastal states. They've done it for a couple of Great Lakes states that have some mountains. One of the concerns that we've had is that Vermont's flooding, as we all know, one year you have a storm that looks very similar to the one of the next year, but they flood very different towns and valleys based on what seem like very minute differences in the weather. So it's different in that respect. Modeling it is different in that respect than it is to model, for example, Manhattan flooding or Houston or one of these more coastal, flatter places. But we were reassured to see that work does seem to be increasingly possible and reliable. It's done, as I said, by multiple experts. Having said that, Vermont does have different characteristics in some probably relevant respects than some of the states that have been done. We're more rural. We have more dirt roads. Our infrastructure tends to be older, things like that. We tend to have a more more sort of concentrated river valley settlement patterns. And some of the RFI responses reflected those differences. We are comfortable at this point that those differences are sort of analytically surmountable, that the work could be done, in a credible and defensible way. So, I said before that, we issued this RFI, and typically an RFI is a precursor to an RFP. We got some funding in Act 122 and haven't spent any of it. We did the RFI, just absorbed it into our, it's just staff time. we got $300,000 in Act 122. One of the things that the RFI, convinced us of is that is probably not adequate to do the level of detail and I won't say novel, but innovative work that is needed, and that is needed in a very defensible and expert way in light of the fact that the state has already been sued on this matter. You always want to do the work well, but it is that point is particularly sharp here. So whoever we do hire needs to be someone who has testified before, who has been qualified as an expert, things like that. And that needs to be true for kind of all aspects of the work. So we have not yet issued an RFP, and our main ask, and this is where I can kind of reflect on what ANR is asking for as well. In Act 122, the deadline for us to do all of this work was January 15th of 26. So, whatever the 8 months from now, we are asking for that deadline to be pushed out by 12 months to January 15th of 27, and also asking for additional funds, $700,000, and additional authority to hire additional funds for one full-time but temporary employee to oversee the work. It may be that we have to hire multiple contractors for this, and we have a small front office. I mean, Ashlyn and I are sort of the policy wing of the front office. So, really feel like in order to do this work right and give it the kind of expert comprehensive treatment it needs, we do need those resources, and ANR's asks are similar, because their work in large part sort of necessarily follows ours. So they're asking for additional funds and just their deadlines to be pushed out that same 12 months. Right. And that's in the language that it's submitted, yes, both to you and to the Senate Natural.
And that's in addition to the 300,000.
That's right.
From the current year that you have,
yeah,
that you will carry forward.
That's right.
Okay.
So that's where we stand. That's sort of the update. We are, my understanding is that Senate Natural is hearing testimony at least through early next week. I think they're contemplating just language, among other things. They're planning a vote sometime next week. Happy to take questions.
So once you, assuming all this goes through, what are we going to have at the end of this 1 year postponed deadline? We're going to have the RFP done or out there? The RFI done.
Yeah, sorry, I should have. I didn't conclude. So we've already done the RFI. We've got responses. We have the RFP close to drafted. Okay. We would issue it very quickly. We can't really issue it until we know about the funding. I mean, we might issue it before we have the funding, but we would need to have some confidence that the funding is coming. So we would issue it as soon as we can. We would get the responses, review them, vet the respondents. As I mentioned, in terms of have they testified in litigation before, things like that.
Sure.
And retain them. At some point in that process, we would hire the person internally to kind of run this, hopefully early in the process. And then at the end of that period, by January 15th of 27, we would have the experts report on the damages.
including the allocation to different entities, or is that a separate phase?
That is a separate phase, which is ANR.
That's the,
Yes.
okay, yeah.
And they can do, my understanding is they can do some of that in parallel, but some of it, obviously the ultimate calculation has to wait for us to complete.
Wow. Interesting. Seems like we really need the ANR in here to talk about this. So a question? Richard. Go ahead.
So your office is gonna do what? Are you creating the fine and defending it?
We are, with expert assistance, determining the total amount of damages and abatement costs statewide. And then ANR and their expert would take that figure and allocate it to the emitters and refiners, or the extractors and refiners. And then ANR would issue demand letters for each entity's share of the figure.
And then they'll just cut us checks. Right?
That part is up to others.
Yeah. Well, can you talk any more about any research or any more information that you have on the process of assessing? I realize you're going out for an RFP,
Right.
for assistance to do this, but anything more you can talk about as far as applications doing your office around how to assess the assessment of damages and abatement costs.
How to assess the assessment.
Yeah. How are you going to? What can you talk about as far as what you've discussed so far?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
Question. I forgot your name already. Sorry.
That's okay. Ashlyn,
Ashlyn, that's
with
right.
the treasurer's office.
Yeah.
I can add maybe just a little bit of color.
Sure.
So
Sure.
in the RFI responses, which are all public, if you're interested in reading them, they're all on ANR's webpage.
Right.
They have a dedicated webpage for this. But so a couple of them talk about various methodologies for different types of hazards.
Mhm.
So the deputy treasurer talked about fluvial erosion, which is basically river flooding.
Mhm.
As being sort of what we think of as Vermont's primary hazard, but another hazard where there has been a lot of research expertise and development of methodology is heat.
Mhm.
There are other hazards that are listed in the legislation that they would like us to evaluate, such as health impacts, for example. And so the RFI responses sort of enumerate different methodologies for different hazards. Each hazard kind of has its own methodology naturally. We, depending on the bids that we receive for an RFP, a third party vendor or contractor that performs this work may have a preference for one methodology over another. We received RFI responses from folks at Dartmouth, Oxford University, a couple of different academic institutions that have been doing this work. Some of these methodologies have been peer reviewed or are in the process of peer review. And so those are the kinds of things that I think that we would look for in evaluating the RFP respondents. And then, I don't want to speak too much about what ANR would do, but there's a similar kind of array of research and choices with respect to the attribution science. For example, if you have Jane Lazorchik from the Climate Action Office, and here she will probably mention the Carbon Majors database, which is a publicly accessible database that has emissions data about sort of like the amount of carbon that's been emitted over certain periods of time. And so some of the methodologies that ANR would be looking for consultants to be evaluating with respect to the attribution science may use one data set for another. So those are the different types of things. I hope that's
Sure. Yeah, so that's helpful. Will the treasurer's office and ANR jointly be selecting RFP, or you do separate RFPs?
They'll be separate RFPs, but I think we would likely ask for their help in evaluating the responses to our RFP. I'm not sure that the converse would be true. Yeah, their climate action office has expertise that would be helpful to us. And, so yes, and we've had a good working relationship with them that's ongoing.
Okay, so the treasurer's office will be issuing its own RFP for
Yes,
the damages and abatement
exactly right.
part of the equation. So
On the subject of the appropriation for all that consulting, I see there's $700,000 in the amendment here, for consultants, third-party services, complete assessment, et cetera, and 125,000 for a 3-year limited service position. What's that?
Right. So that is a limited service position is just the state government term for a sort of non-permanent, but potentially full-time, with benefits position, someone to basically reside in our office and run this work so that Ashlyn and I could do
Your
the
job.
rest of the the treasurer's office.
Yes.
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 So it's just that, and that number, I think, probably contemplates someone who's maybe not at all times working 40 hours a week. So the limited service aspect just gives us more flexibility as far as hours and things, and it doesn't commit the state to another employee forever.
Got it. Thanks.
So yeah.
it's tough. So trying to wrap my head around the appropriations. You have 300,000 that you haven't expended anything yet. So you're already coming back asking for more. When we already know that this is in litigation. And we have no idea whether it's going to be in our favor, but we're looking to expend a great deal of money with potential no outcome. How can we explain that?
Well, I think, the Act 122 already requires us to do this work. And we need to do the work well, partly because of that litigation, because we'll have to be able to defend it in the litigation. And the 300,000, I think, was really a placeholder that contemplated us doing this RFI and coming back when we knew more. So I appreciate your question, and it is a program that the legislature passed, and as it currently stands, we are tasked with doing the work, and from what we know now, we think we need more resources to do the work well.
Superior had a other side. Real next.
Apologize for coming in late. So if I ask you a question that you've already covered, please, I'll take it off. So where else could we get the information that we are asking you all to get for us? Is that something that is being developed nationally or internationally? Are there other think tanks that are trying to put this information together? Is there some place else where the legislature could turn to get this information right now?
I do not believe so. No. I mean, the information that we were asked to get it's very Vermont specific. As I said earlier, and you weren't here, I apologize, but there are some of these professors and research institutions have done this work for other states specifically, but there's no one who's done it sort of nationwide. There's not like a Pew Charitable Trust's equivalent, website that does it for every state. So feel free to jump in.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add, and this is with respect to the request in the H319 language to move the deadlines out 12 months, is that the state of New York is currently, they sort of just announced in January that they are doing a similar pursuit. And changing the deadline would not only allow for the requisite amount of time that we think that we need to do the work, but it would also put us in line with New York State's process and timeline. And so there is a possibility that as state governments, we could sort of have, tactic conversations and leverage work resources, troubleshooting with what they are doing. Though the calculations have to be Vermont specific for the purposes of the demand letters, being sort of the first two states in the nation to go about doing this, there's a real possibility that we can learn from one another if we are on a similar timeline.
How many other states? I know there are a number of other states that have this as something they are contemplating. Are there any other states that have passed it yet?
Just New York as
Just
far
New
as
York.
we're.
Just New York, yeah. I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to how many other states are contemplating
There's
it.
quite a
I
few.
think that probably some of the advocacy, the environmental advocacy organizations have more information.
And then I have two other questions, if I might.
Sure.
Is that right? So to your knowledge, have we ever received any support from the fossil fuel industry for any of our natural disasters that happen here to offset any costs or contributions, help rebuilding?
I would not be the person to answer that authoritatively. There is a fund within ANR that compensates for, oil spills and things like that. As far as natural disasters go, I couldn't answer that. I'm not aware of it.
Okay. And then my last question is, if we fail to act on the request that you're bringing forward, what will happen? What's the effect?
I think the effect is that we would likely be unable to do the work. We just, and we've said this from the beginning that, we don't have the expertise inside the treasurer's office to do that work. So I think the work would not get done.
I can follow up on that. The 825,000 appropriations on top of the 300,000 that you have parked somewhere.
Yes.
So you're thinking it's a shade over $1 million. One is what it's going to cost you to do all this
Yes.
stuff that you have been asked to do.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Bearing in mind that it now includes very likely, testimony at trial, expert reports, those sorts of things. I mean, that's a change since Act 122 was passed.
And was this money included in any appropriations? It was not.
It was not included in the House passed budget. I don't believe that the Senate has made a decision yet. They're just starting to dig into the budget, so about whether or not.
Do you know whether the money for ANR was included? Neither.
Also not included in the House passed budget.
Oh. It's hard to come by this year. I know that.
Imagine. Be hard to come by for natural disasters.
Yeah.
As well.
Oh, that's fact. Thank you. What else can we ask you? I don't know. I think maybe we're, well, thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think our next testimony is scheduled for 2:00. So we have
Great.
A little break.
a little break. We'll go off live.